Hi, Devon. Welcome to the podcast. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you. So, in this podcast, I explore the intersection between personal growth, urbanism, technology, real estate development. And so, I have a big Venn diagram with your interests. So, again, thank you for having the time to do this podcast. So, could you go into a little detail about your history, what you have done in the past, and your interests, please?
Sure. So I'm a little bit all over the map, but there are some threads that sort of tie it all together. I studied computer science in college. And at the same time, I was the editor in chief of the Stanford Review, economics focused paper on campus. And then after that, I became a software engineer. And after that, I became very involved in housing policy in San Francisco. San Francisco doesn't build enough housing, and I was trying to fix that. And I've also done some work in some crypto companies. And my most recent job was as a product manager at GitHub, where I was building financial systems for open source developers to make money. I recently quit my job at GitHub and I've been exploring the space of charter cities and startup cities. And so I'm really excited about Porta Norte. There's a lot of potential in Latin America for charter cities. The thread that runs through all of the things that I've worked on in my career is a very big interest in social organization and innovating on social organization, because I think that a lot of the institutions that we have gotten us far, I don't think we have any reason to think that the institutions we have are the best form they could possibly be. People talk a lot about conventional technology, electrical engineering and software and airplanes and those sort of things. And those are very important. And medicine, all those things are very important, but I think social technology is just as important as all of those other types of technology, but very understudied. I've been exploring that space and thinking about what I want to do next with regard to that.
So the common thread between that is the dilemma of the designer, or like you and a lot of people in the startup community or in the internet that is very, very focused on software engineering are also interested in urbanism. That's quite a recent insight. It's very interesting how the Venn diagram of interests is intertwined. You recently did a tweet that said the urge, I'm paraphrasing, that the urge of doing your own home versus programming your language came from the same place. Have you noticed this? What patterns have you seen?
Yeah, I think you're spot on. A lot of people in the software, Silicon Valley, San Francisco tech world, and beyond, they're interested in urbanism because it mirrors a lot of the types of problems that we run into in our work day to day. So imagine that you work at Twitter or Facebook or any of these social networks. What I like to think of it as you're building, it's a city that doesn't have buildings, but a website is like a building. A website has a lot of similarities to architecture. And that sounds like a strange concept when you think about it because it's not three-dimensional. You can't walk in it. Your avatar can be in it. And there is a sense of space and how people relate. And so fundamentally, what these platforms are doing, just like any architect would do, is to design how people interact with each other. But they're more like cities than buildings because cities are all about the sort of organic interactions that people have. There's the mayor of New York City doesn't know everything that's happening in New York, just like how Mark Zuckerberg doesn't know everything that's happening on Facebook. And they can't even imagine what all the things are happening, both for good and bad. And so I think cities are just a really rich source of metaphors for the kinds of work that a lot of tech companies are doing. I could go into a lot of other similarities as well, but I think that's like the major hook that pulls people in.
And these similarities go back a long time. I remember a talk. There's one very famous book in architecture. I don't know if you know it. It's called A Pattern Language by Christopher Alexander. Mm-hmm. And I saw a video of him. He was a professor at Berkeley or something like that. He made a talk explaining this situation that he had gotten into, and that he went to give classes and it was full of computer scientists. And he didn't understand why. His book became famous in the computer science community because the structure of patterns that he laid out in a pattern language is the same structure or type of thinking for computer scientists. And he discovered this weird correlation between designers of the physical and the digital world. That's when you're a designer and you're looking how to improve everything, and you see the problem in everything, then you get a little bit irritated when things are not right. Unfortunately, some designs of our cities are cringy worthy, so it's impossible not to pay attention to it. That book is amazing and I recommend it to everybody. This book is excellent. Like, if you want to build your own home, the core concept is that you don't need an architect for anything, because in the past, people and cities didn't rely on architects. They did it on their own. If you go to cities of the past, they are the ones who have very charming streets where everything is romantic, walkable, and everything works very well. Everybody built their own home, and it was a community thing. It was very open source. And that correlation is extremely cool.
So there's another connection between programmers and architecture that I've never really explained before, but I think the types of people who go into software are often pretty impatient people, myself included, people who want things to be built fast. They don't want to ask for permission. And software, in a lot of cases, is great for that, because you can pull up your text editor and start writing code that runs today, and you don't need to have a piece of land to do it or anything like that. You just need to have your laptop. I think a lot of software engineers have fantasies of building things in the physical world, but feel it's much harder because you're dealing with atoms instead of bits. And so you're fundamentally dealing with real costs. You're dealing with neighbors who may or may not like what you're doing. You're dealing with, if things break, then you have to fix it, as opposed to just rerunning the code. And so I think that, I'll speak for myself, this extends to a lot of other programmers, is this feeling of we want to do things in the real world, but we just don't have the patience for it, which I think is very unfortunate, because most of the most important things that can happen in the real world, like your life, is more based on the real world than the connections that happen to be made, which are very important too. But software can only go so far in improving your quality of life.
That want to change something fast permeates the physical world, but it takes much longer. Rearranging atoms is much harder than rearranging bits. There are so many people from software engineering who want to do experiments. I have talked to many who have wanted to do tasks or build a community with their friends, and it is extremely hard. There are so many experiments digitally, but very few physical experiments get executed in the real world. I want to do a small parenthesis. You wrote this blog post on startup cities. I found it because Balaji retweeted your post. I read your blog post, and Portanor fell into one of the categories you defined in your post, and I wanted to connect. And so I did. Then I sent you the link to a blog post I wrote on startup cities. And then you said you had already read my blog post. Then we started talking about our interest in urbanism and the startups, etc. But mainly startup cities. I sent you a link a few weeks later about other people who had done a compendium of all the startup cities around the world, and they used your categories. And so the idea permeated. I wanted to go a little bit into the framework and categories you listed in your blog post, which are economic opportunity, competitive governance, lifestyle, community, and technological experimentation. Can you go into detail on each, please?
Sure. I should have a disclaimer that these are a simplification of motivations. Certainly, there's other things that are probably not covered in here, and a lot of detail that it's not perfect, but they're like rough groupings of the types of motivations I've seen for startup city founders. So I guess the first of the 5 is economic opportunity. And it's really about unleashing economic development, reducing poverty and reducing unemployment in different places. And I think people here in the US don't have that much appreciation for is just how screwed up certain basic institutions are in most of the world. And that's not to say that US institutions are perfect or great either, but we've solved certain problems that other places haven't quite solved. So for example, China in the 1970s was super communist, and they didn't have any private property whatsoever. And you couldn't leave your job if you didn't want to, because you were assigned your job and you did that for your whole life. Lots of things like that resulted in huge misallocation of capital and labor in the market and land. In the 1980s, they created a special economic zone in Shenzhen where they changed a lot of those things. They're still technically communist, but they made it so that people could lease land for 99 years, which is similar to ownership in some ways.
In England, I think.
Yeah, I think a number of places have done that as well. I'm not sure about England. I think Singapore has a similar system. They're all slightly different though. And basically China did all these things to bring more market competitive pressures to their economy. And in Shenzhen, the GDP like 10x within just a few years. It was very quick. There's other places in the world. China is now doing a lot better because they've adopted a lot of the same reforms that Shenzhen was experimenting with in the 1980s. There's a lot of other countries in the world that have differently but backwards policies that hold back economic development. They might have people who are incredibly talented and energetic. They have a labor law, so you can't fire ineffective employees basically at all. So that's a long way of describing it, but that's what the economic opportunity perspective is for startup cities. And this is also very well aligned with business model, because if you create a lot of economic development and increase people's productivity in your city, there's probably hundreds, thousands, infinite ways to capture some of that value back to yourself. And if you're owning the land that this is happening on, you can benefit a lot. So that's the economic opportunity reason.
Yes.
Yes. The second one, these are not in any particular order, by the way.
Okay.
The second one is around competitive governance. Someone I'm very close to is currently going through their green card process to get permanent residency in the United States. And this is a complete mess of a process. He had to send in this medical paperwork to show that he didn't have certain diseases or whatever. The first time he sent it in, they got back to him and said, oh, sorry, you filled out the form in blue pen and not black pen. So you have to do it again. He sent it again, and then I said, oh, sorry, you sent it in on A4 paper instead of letter size paper. You have to send it in again. And there's this back and forth until like finally a few days ago, they were like, okay, you got the paperwork done correctly. Thank you. This is totally backwards. This is a complete waste of time. It was a complete waste of money. He had to like resend these letters a bunch of times at very high cost, because he had to send them in on high-speed shipping. So it was like $50 per letter that he had to send, and he had to take time out of his work day to like go to the post office and mail it by hand. By contrast, Dubai, Singapore, and Estonia have a ton of their government services online, and this sort of thing is you submit a form and in 10 seconds you're done, and it's that. And these government agencies are held accountable for the quality of the services they provide. And so what I mean by competitive governance, there are some governments in the world, very few sadly, but hopefully a growing number, that treat governance as a product. They say, how do we make governance as good as possible for our citizens so we're not wasting their time, we're not making them spend useless money, we're not putting them in situations where they live or whatever it is in jeopardy just because they like filled out some paper wrong. But unfortunately, most countries, most states, most cities don't act that way. Instead, they know that they have a captive audience. This guy I'm talking about, he's not going to just leave the United States just because of this one paperwork, but they know that they have a captive audience. And so they don't have to have good services, just like any monopoly. So I think one thing that's exciting to me about startup cities is that as more of these come online, there will be more competitive pressure, and people will leave if they don't feel like their government is serving them. So that's number two. Number three is lifestyle. And lifestyle sounds like a sort of, what's the word? Like not petty, but superficial thing. And, maybe in some cases it is, but in other cases, it's purely about safety. A lot of places in Latin America and a lot of other places in the world too, but I'm most familiar with Latin America. Some cities in Latin America are just not safe to live in. If you live in Sao Paulo or Buenos Aires or something like that, like your kid might get mugged, your house might get broken into, people might carjack you, stuff like that. You might get kidnapped. And so something that I think startup cities have an opportunity to offer is, how do you create a place that is safer? Now, this is not going to be true in every single place in the world. Luckily, not every city, not every country is dangerous like Brazil, but in the places where that is the case, I think startup cities will provide really important options for people to live a life where they're not worried that their children are going to get kidnapped. Lifestyle can also include other things that are not quite as serious as physical safety. It might be that you really want to live on a Caribbean island, and that's really important for you for your lifestyle because you're like into scuba diving or something like that. I think that scuba diving communities might pop up and there might be a startup city that serves them. That's a random one. I don't know if it's a good business idea, but that's one version.
New ski towns might also be startup communities.
I have not looked into the numbers, but I would bet a lot of money that like Aspen in Colorado and a bunch of other ski towns have seen a lot more people move there during COVID, because now that more people can work remotely, they are going to live where they can do their hobbies, where they think it's beautiful, where they have a beautiful house. Ski towns
and to serve them all year round. Now they're adapting the mountains for mountain bike. With that, they can have an active community all year long. And
that's great.
And that's them improving their product.
I did not know of that. That makes a lot of sense. It's probably almost as fun as skiing. So probably even more fun for some people. So the fourth category that I have is the idea of community. So a place for like-minded people to live together. Like this has already existed in some shapes and forms, but it usually I think exists as vacation towns. So one place that I'm personally really familiar with is a town called Chautauqua in upstate New York. And they have this 9-week program each summer. So like June through August, where they offer sermons, lectures, ballets, theater, all sorts of things like that are mostly geared, I would say, towards retired people, but those retired people also invite their children and their grandchildren to stay with them. So my grandma goes to this place every single summer and hangs out with her friends who are into the same opera that she's into. And they have a beautiful town where she knows that when she walks outside, she's going to be friends with everyone there, or would like to be friends with everyone there because they like a lot of the same stuff. Now, Chautauqua has always been a summer place because it's more of a vacation spot where you take a few weeks off of the year and you go. But again, now with more remote work, I think there's more space for this to become more of a year-round sort of thing. I don't know if Chautauqua will specifically evolve to become that, but I think that a Chautauqua-like place could exist for all sorts of different types of people who like different types of things. So people who share values want to live together, as opposed to in a place where they may not share values with their neighbor. And then the fifth one, and sort of the last one that I have on my list, is around technological and social experimentation. So right now, roughly all of the land on Earth is claimed by a nation state. There's a few exceptions. Basically, all land is claimed all land that you would want. And those nation states tend to have laws in place about what you can and cannot do. I happen to think that the menu of laws and legal systems and social structures that exists out there, it's only a tiny subset of what's possible. I think that it's a shame that we don't really have a frontier anymore, because we can't go out and experiment with social structures in the way that we used to be able to. You used to be able to like just go farther out, and if you disagreed with
frontier, right?
I think that's a little far away, but maybe we'll get there. He's literally far away, but hopefully I would love for us to open a new frontier, because I think frontiers both challenge the older places to reconsider whether what they're doing is good or not, and they also just create space for weirdos to try stuff out. And so the kinds of things that I would love to see experimentation for are things like life extension or medical tourism. I'm personally of the belief that if you are towards the end of your life and you want to try a drug that might save your life, then you should be able to try it. But like in most countries in the world, you can't do that. And instead of trying to reform those countries can have their own laws if they want, but without a frontier to challenge that, it makes it much harder. You also might want to have people experiment with flying cars or something like that, or space travel. I see creating new frontier as a valuable social ad, because it'll give us space to experiment and figure out what we're missing in our existing communities. So those are the 5. To repeat them real quick, it was economic opportunity, competitive governance, lifestyle, community, and technological experimentation. Again, there's probably some missing. So if anyone thinks of something that doesn't fit into those categories, I'd be super interested to hear it.
Let's talk a little bit more about examples of each of these. So economic opportunity for each its own has a connotation of import and export, but special economic zones are ways to have a better tax structure or immigration laws that makes people be there and produce more and be more effective in their production. One of the best examples of this category is Singapore, I guess. But what do you expect to see here? Is there something else rather than special economic zones and free trade zones? What do you expect to see in the future? What are the best examples today?
So you touched on how free trade zones and special economic zones usually have an import-export connotation. I think that's right. One thing I would love to see people experiment, maybe Porto Norte, is around what would a free trade zone for knowledge work look like? I don't think that's been tried before. The closest thing that I'm aware of is the Dubai International Financial Center, the IFC, but they're very focused on finance and fintech and also oil for the Middle East.
Can you explain a little bit more?
Dubai is a really interesting city. It's an Emirati. So like the UAE has, I think it's 7 Emiratis, which is like a federal system. And then each of the 7 Emiratis has a king or a monarch. Dubai is one of the 7. In the 1970s, Dubai had only a few 10,000 people, something like that. And at the time, the king decided that they were going to invest in import-export infrastructure and simplify the laws and lower taxes and stuff like that. And now, for anyone who knows about Dubai, it's not that small anymore. It's millions of people. It has some of the most like modern towers in the world. There's also a lot of very valid critiques of Dubai that I won't get into, but they exist and I agree with some of them. But you can't get around the fact that it's very impressive that they took it from a little fishing village to a global trade center. And then in the 2000s, I think it was like 2004, they decided they wanted to attract more financial businesses like banks because they thought that would help the region, especially Africa, get access to capital. But then they realized that the legal system didn't work very well with the English common law system, which is what most finance is done around the world. And so they decided to create this special zone inside of Dubai called the Dubai International Financial Center, which operated on a completely different set of laws. It was on English common law and different commercial laws and that sort of thing.
They can even have foreigners, something like a board of directors or something like that.
Exactly. Usually there's restrictions on how many foreigners can be owners of a business. Businesses in DIFC can be 100% foreign owned if you want. And that's done very well and I think generates hundreds of millions of dollars of GDP a year that like didn't exist before. So anyway, that's all saying that what they're doing is the most similar thing to a free trade zone for knowledge work, but it's still pretty constrained to just finance. It'd be really interesting to think, what if you like created a zone that was focused on people who build internet businesses or something like that? What would that look like?
What would that look like for you?
It's a good question. I should think about that. Fast internet is, of course, the number one most important thing. I think what I touched on earlier around the government having simpler processes would be very important. I spend more time than I would like dealing with various like government interfaces. I had to get my driver's license renewed recently and wait in line. No one should have to go through that because it's just, I know it sounds so petty and so small, but like those sorts of things, if you think about how many people in the world have spent hours waiting in line for a driver's license, that's a lot of wasted time where those humans could be doing anything else with their life and creating value, being with their family, exercising, sleeping, whatever. And those sorts of things. And that's a driver's license. It's not even that important, let alone, I don't know, Medicare or something life-threatening. Digitized government services and having maybe a concierge service where if you have questions, you can call a support person and they'll help you navigate the bureaucracy, I think would be great. Those are the first ones off the top of my head. I could probably give you better answers if I thought about it. Yeah.
If you do something for knowledge workers, it's grabbing the 5 categories you just mentioned and pushing the envelope and trying to improve all of them. If you are a technological worker, you want a good lifestyle. You want to ski, mountain bike. You want a community with like-minded people where you can deep conversations over coffee. You want technological experimentation where the government doesn't meddle in your things or inhibit the growth of your company. You also want competitive governance. You want the place to work, like just to work. That's it. that they try to attract you and give a smooth onboarding. You want economic opportunity and ecosystem businesses that generate know-how. That would be my guess.
Yeah, and related to that, also just a feeling that the government is responsive to you. If there's something deeply wrong in the place that I live, I don't feel very confident that it will change. The cities I've lived in don't feel very flexible and bendable. And some of that is good because people shouldn't be able to just change anything all the time for everyone else and hurt them or whatever. But there's also certain things that are just like really terrible inefficiencies that you can see walking around. And I feel like if you see this on a website, you can often email the CEO, and if they agree with you, will send their best team to go solve that problem. And so this is not a guaranteed thing. I'm not saying that always works either. There's a feeling of responsiveness that you just don't get in an urban landscape usually.
Yeah. In urbanism, you want everything to work like Lee Kuan Yew and just do as I say and don't let everybody complain, because then nothing will happen. That was the start of what you were fighting in housing in San Francisco in a video you had about discretionary review. And also you gave the example of Haussmann in Paris, that basically if we want to get big things done, few people will get trampled upon.
There's maybe you're thinking of the famous phrase, to make an omelet, you need to break some eggs or something like that. Is that what you're referring to? Yeah. I think that to clarify my position, because I think this is really important, I am not in favor of totalitarian governments or monarchies and stuff like that. But at the same time, democracy, especially consensus-driven democracy, where everyone or many people have to agree, and if anyone gets in your way, then now you have to stop the whole thing. That also doesn't work very well. So what I think is a really interesting alternative is with startup cities. You can have little baby kingdoms where people can leave if they don't like what you're doing. And so what this means is no one gets trampled because they leave. If Haussmann comes and tries to take away, they just say, no, I'm leaving, I'm gonna sell my land. I refuse to live in a community like this. But you also get the benefits of some of the top-down coordination that can happen. And so I think living in a world where you have lots of smaller cities and you have open borders, now that's a really big, we do not currently have today. My ideal world would have lots of little tiny kingdoms run by businesses, most likely, where the CEO gets to decide what happens. But then you can choose any of those cities that you want to go to, and you go to the one where you agree with how they approach things. This would result in the best of both worlds, where people get to choose. They're not coerced into anything. All the choices they make are what they think matters. But at the same time, you have someone who can see the bigger picture and have a bigger design. And this could be someone who does things that I totally disagree with. That's fine, because I can just leave. I don't have to live there. Now, I think the question is, how do we get to that future? I don't know how to do that, because I think we're very far from having anything that resembles open borders. And culturally, we're very far from that. So I don't know how useful this image is that I'm painting, but it is an image that I would love to see.
I would say there are baby steps that are going that way. Current examples would be Selena. It's a hybrid between hotel and hostel. It's targeted millennials, and you can do a lot of yoga, art, meditation, and they started in Panama, in Casco Viejo, about 7 years ago. Now they have over 60 destinations. Their business model includes helping the community, and the community becomes part of the development. Some people go to Costa Rica, then to Panama, then Colombia, staying in Selena. If Selena had more billions of dollars, they could do that on a wider scale in each country they're in. And they could do not only a building, but they could do. These might be the initial steps towards that future.
This looks really cool. Yeah, I'm poking around their website, and I definitely have to check this out more. Yeah, I think we're going to see more of those. The issue is that the Westphalian nation state system doesn't allow for this very easily. It's very hard for many people to get visas in different countries and that sort of thing. Luckily, within the United States, the US is a very large country. And so I was able to recently move from San Francisco to Miami because I disagree with a lot of the way that San Francisco governance is going. So I voted with my feet. But a lot of people don't live in countries that are so big, that have such diversity of cities. For example, my boyfriend, who's from Argentina, Buenos Aires is the main city. There's all other cities going on, but they're not terribly different compared to LA. If you're a musician, you can go to LA. If you're a software engineer, you can go to San Francisco. You have this specialization of cities. It'll be interesting to see in the next 10 to 20 years, does the system bend or break because I think more and more people are going to want to live that way, where they can choose the city that they live in based off of their profession or based off of their values or whatever it is that they care about with where they live. But right now, it's not working very well for that system.
It is not. But I would say that the pandemic has opened up a lot of places, many countries, including Panama, who have made new laws for digital nomads. It has happened in Malaga. In the US, there are some places that even pay you to come. There will be a competition for talent, and that competition will force governments to hopefully be more competitive in their governance, because they will have more competition and people will be able to move. So the countries that take advantage of that will emerge and rise in value. And things like El Salvador and what is happening with Bitcoin, making it a legal tender, it's going to have so many benefits there. And they're opening up for digital nomads. They have the openness to receive technological, progressive people, etc. People who want to be outside the US, and arbitrage between earning in the US and spending in Latam or whatever else. That will happen more. Panama has an experiment for knowledge people. It's 120 hectares, and it was previously a military base for the US in the Panama Canal Zone. It's called Ciudad del Saber, or City of Knowledge. It's a special economic zone where they have attracted universities, the United Nations, goals, businesses, and multinational companies. It has been extremely successful. And it's all services, companies, and none of the import-export. I use it as a model. Explain what we want to do in Porta Norte. We are going to brand it or market it as a special economic zone, because we're not going to be in the import-export business. But we do want people to start a company, have better labor laws and tax structure, and bypass some of the red tape that happens when people want to come to Panama.
What are some things that the Ciudad de Saber has done to attract people? Why are people and companies and universities moving there?
Because they have a better tax structure, basically, and better labor laws.
Are these universities coming from abroad, or are they Panamanian?
From abroad. Yeah. A lot of them come from the U.S., Louisville, Florida State University, Universidad Francisco Marroquín, and others. They have better fiscal incentives. The government of Panama is betting on indirect benefits of having more educated people over here, more university, and not from a direct tax they charge.
That makes sense.
It must be something. I don't know how much, but it's very little. They have other benefits, which I don't remember right now, but those are the two core components of it. And so that's what we are trying to do over here, because the problem in new projects, if it's not a company town, it usually becomes a place with no life in the days, but everybody comes only to sleep, because usually companies benefit moving there when there are a lot of residents. So it's a chicken of egg problem that we are struggling. And we have a bunch of strategies to fight that, but it's something that you have to fight.
Right. That's very exciting. I've been meaning to check it out. I should go to City of Knowledge, a place that someone can just drive in or walk in. And
actually, I used to work there. I worked at a venture capital firm in Ciudad del Saber. So it's all interrelated. The DNA of Ciudad del Saber has permeated to Porta Norte. Being there came the inspiration, like, oh, it's so important to invest in public spaces, because they have a bunch of public spaces. So important to bet on universities. Like, how do you create this virtual cycle? And it has been extremely successful, really. They cannot build more. It's all occupied, basically. And so what we're talking about in-house is positioning ourselves. Like, when people graduate from City of Knowledge, we bring them over here. And so we have been talking to some business owners. There's also another chicken and egg problem. Usually when these companies come from abroad, they want the structure. They don't want to invest in capital expenditures for building the structures. They just want to rent it. It's something that we're working on, rearranging atoms has a lot of complications and a lot of things have
Yeah.
to be aligned, but we're working towards it.
It's cool to hear though that you already have some idea of what the market would be, because it's the people who want to be in Ciudad de Saber but can't. So
Or that they have grown too big for them. And so
Makes sense.
we can give them more land. Since how long ago have you been interested in urbanism? I saw you wrote about it, I don't know, 7 years ago. You read Jeff Speck, Walkable City. I know Jeff Speck very well. You know
Oh,
that?
cool.
Yeah.
No, I didn't know that.
Yeah. That's, I was, and
How did you meet
basically,
him?
I was starting Porta Norte, and I was very into TED Talks, and I liked his TED Talk. So I contacted him. I wrote him
Great.
an email. We had a talk. It was before the book. He gave me the roadmap of who to hire. And he gave me 3 architecture firms. And then I went to the Congress of the New Urbanism. And I interviewed each of them. And he was busy at the time, but he recommended I to Andres Duani, the master planner of Porta Norte. So he was a very important influence in Porta Norte. You made a good book review on your blog, which I'll also put in the show notes. You also did another blog post after that. Let's build places for people, not for cars.
Exactly. Yeah. I don't know. I think I've been interested in cities for quite a while. I don't know if there was one moment where I was immediately interested in it. How could you not be interested? I don't know. You know what I mean?
It's not that common. It's really not that common.
It's just so interesting. I don't have a really interesting answer there. I think it's just, I feel like cities are such an interesting intersection of economics and architecture and engineering and politics and like all of these different types of things that I find so interesting. And you need to understand all of them to be able to build them, I think. So just really interesting challenge, and it really matters. People tend to vastly underestimate the importance of infrastructure in their life. Mm-hmm. And when I say infrastructure, I'm not just talking about highways and sewage and water pipes and stuff like that. I'm talking about the platform that they're living their life on. Like, what does the environment around them make it easy to do? And what does the environment around them make it really hard to do? And I think that these shape the outcomes in people's lives a lot more than they realize. This comes even down to really small details, like having chocolate in your house makes it a lot more likely you're going to eat chocolate. So when you go to the grocery store, don't buy chocolate. Maybe you can buy it when you're out at a restaurant or something, but don't bring it into your house. Or if you want to eat chocolate, go for it. If you have a goal of eating less, just don't put it in your house. That's like a micro example, but there's also like examples of, does your street have a lot of trees and nice sidewalks that you can walk on? Or is it like really big roads with cars going fast and there's no trees to protect you from the sun? You're going to walk less. And it might not be even an active choice, but you're just going to do it because the environment is pushing you away from walking. These sorts of things are really important and underlooked, and we need to design spaces that match how we want to live our life. And I don't think that we're doing that right now.
We are not doing that right now. And why is that? Why have the incentives changed? And how can you align incentives better to make that? And let me add to that a little bit. Cities from before had public spaces, and cities nowadays have very few parks and public spaces. I don't know if that is also what you have seen. And I wonder, why has that happened? Is it because all of the building is delegated to the real estate developers? Are municipalities not doing what they need to do historically? What is happening? No new places in Panama have public spaces. Important that we're taking the role of the municipality and we're building them. But I wonder what has happened, what incentives have changed, and maybe the answer is just cars and that people don't care about public spaces anymore, but I don't think that's true.
I think there's a mixture of things. The top one that comes to mind for me is that in the last 100 years, we have released a lot of the constraints that we have on ourselves around where we need to live. It used to be that you had to live in walking distance to your job at a factory or to your fields or whatever it was, because there was like roughly no other way to get around. And you had to live in certain places because it was safer to protect against bandits, So you had to live in tighter knit communities with walls, which create interesting constraints that create towns. You can have air conditioning, so you can live in hot places which have a lot of open land, like Florida, where I live, or Texas or whatever. And a lot of those things are great because in a lot of ways, life has gotten a lot better. But the lack of constraints has caused us to run into a lot more coordination problems. Before, the constraints forced us to coordinate because we all had to be in the same place in the same time. So we had to solve these types of problems and we were closer together. Now people like create their own little castle in their property and they optimize for building the nicest house with the nicest yard for themselves and their family. And they don't think, I think, externally so much. And it's because they can just get in their car and drive to the edge of where the city is and buy a piece of land that they can afford and they build there. I think it's also because like it's more within your control to create a beautiful yard for you and your family. It's like a lot harder to get your community of thousands of people, millions of people maybe, to coordinate and create a park and to agree upon what should be at the park and that kind of thing. So long story short, the reduction in constraints has made it so that coordination is more necessary for us to do things together. So people just do the easier thing, basically. But people would still value having these public spaces and people would still value having a tighter knit community. A typical American family, it's a little harder for me to generalize this globally, but like a typical American family, I think when they look at their options for housing, maybe you're a young couple with kids and you're buying a house or an apartment. The numbers that you see on Zillow, the real estate buying website in the US, the square footage of the house, but you don't have an easy way to measure how close you are to your friends and how likely it is you're going to run into somebody at a coffee shop. Like those are much harder to measure, so they don't end up on the Zillow page. And as a result, people make decisions based off the square footage of their house and how big their yard is, and they underrate other things that make life nice and important and valuable and your friends and your community. So I think it's also like a measurement issue.
What company was starting to incorporate the walk score? Do you know about that?
Yeah, I'm familiar. The walk score is a good step forward. I don't think it fully captures everything you want, but like I'm happy to see that development. And I think that's typical now on Zillow. But I don't know. I think people are just still way more likely to maximize the number of rooms in their house than they are to maximize their walk score, which you could say, okay, that's their revealed preference and that's actually what they care about. I'm a little more inclined to think that it's a little bit short-termist and you like love to think about what you're going to do with that like new room, but actually but realize that having one less room in your house is fine so that you can be close to the people that you love. That's my bias and the way I make decisions. And I'm probably putting that on other people. And I don't know if everybody else has the same values.
When I see new development, they put the house in the middle of the lot and they have a yard all the way around. Sometimes they even put a huge wall between the sidewalk and the home. How it was done in the past is that you always put the house or the structure right next to the sidewalk. That's how it's in Porta Norte. This is the sidewalk, this is the building, it's here. It's not over here, because then this becomes parking or a wall, or it just becomes things against the public space. So it's incredibly important to put all of the structures next to the sidewalk. You might lose a little bit of privacy, but what it does to the public spaces is it creates the outside room where people can walk and feel safe and creates eyes on the street, and it makes that active lifestyle.
I'm personally more laissez-faire, where the battle that I'm fighting is more that most cities require the opposite. They require setbacks. In the US, most cities require your building to be such and such far away from the street. They say you cannot have your house this close to the next house over. And what that's practically saying is you're making everything like way more, and that sounds good. In my opinion, it's good. And what I personally want is just lift those restrictions, just let people build what they want to build. And I think like with Porta Norte, it's also great that you're trying out like a different set of constraints. Mm-hmm. But for me, I'm just like, let's just let people build, if people don't want to build parking into their house because they plan to bike everywhere, just let them do that. Mm-hmm. Most cities right now have parking minimums, which I think is a whole discussion that is very unintuitive for most people. But like some people don't have a car. Requiring to build a parking space is subsidizing it.
So you would like Houston?
I've never been to Houston, so I
Okay.
can't say if I would agree with that.
Yeah.
What I would like is to allow people, like there's a lot of instances of developers in San Francisco who like want to build a building that is right next to transit in a part of San Francisco that doesn't need a car really at all. And they are still required to have 2 parking spaces per unit in the building, which is subsidizing space for cars when we have a housing crisis that like people can't afford to live like housing. We shouldn't be subsidizing cars. We should be making it cheaper to build stuff. So that's what I'm fighting against. I'm not saying it is the end all be all, but just the margin that we're at right now is, I think the margin that we're at, we need to shift towards more laissez-faire. But I'm also excited to see like, you know, what I was saying earlier about little kings, little CEOs like running projects. I think in those cases, they should be more restrictive, like what you're talking about with Puerto Norte, to like experiment. And if it works great, people will want to live there. It sounds like a place I would want to live. And if it doesn't work, people won't live there and the market will, you know, punish you for it. And that's good. That is how it should be. The issue is when it's upheld at the government level where it becomes illegal to build what you're building or build something else. That's where it becomes a problem for me.
Yeah. What I love the most in experiments, which is very uncommon in real estate, is building places with concepts and meanings behind them. Like just have a vision and execute, try to create a compelling vision to attract other people, to attract residents, etc. Having a real concept, like developing mountain bike town or university town or a place for technological progressives. Let's do a place that is just focused in nature and just put trees all over, or do solar punk visions. Or I just want more places to rise. I am a little bit down that there are so few experiments that I know of, and that usually the people involved are very old and very conservative. And I understand, because there is so much money behind projects that if you do something very different, you risk a lot and you risk absorption. The capital expenditures for making these type of projects and it fail, it's like a huge deal, and you play with so many people's money. So it's hard to push the envelope because you have that resistance. And I wonder how we could enable, and how will the future change to enable more startup cities and make it easier to push the envelope without so many problems, hardships, and conservative philosophy. So can you tell me a little bit about going to Pronomos? Could you explain what it is and what they're looking for and what they wish there was to invest in? What is your philosophy that you think they should be focused on? What is the future of venture capital in startup cities? How would you project that future?
So I work at a venture capital fund called Pronomos Capital. I am an entrepreneur in residence there, which means I help out with investments, and I'm looking at projects that I might be able to start or join as well. Pronomos is focused on charter cities and startup cities and companies that exist to serve those types of new projects. So it could also be software as a service for a city potentially. And right now, the biggest bottleneck for Pronomos is number of founders. There's just a very small pipeline of people working on this, just like what you're talking about. And it's not zero. I think that's a misconception. A lot of people think that it's zero. There are a lot of great people working on it, but we need more. And so this is one of the reasons I was so excited to meet you, Henry, is because you are actually quite far along with one of these types of projects. The number one thing that the space needs to see is a success story. Right now, and the challenge is that these projects take a long time, take a while before we see a real success, where we have success would be like several thousand people living in a town and they are happy to be there and plan to be there long term. That would be like what I would count as an initial success. I would hope that it would grow even more beyond that, but that would be the first point people would start to look at it and be like, oh, this is legit. This is a thing that can work. And we're starting to see some traction here. And Prospera is a charter city in Honduras, which only has about 30 people living there right now. So it's still quite small. Puerto Norte There's no one living there right now. You guys are still doing the infrastructure build out. In the next few years, we're going to start to see a few of these examples pop up. And once we have one sort of poster child success, I think that a lot more people are going to see that this is possible. Going back to what we were talking about before with technology people, I think software people, myself included, are a little intimidated by the idea of doing something in the real world. Like we've done everything with bits for our whole career. And so it almost sounds impossible to build a building, which I don't literally believe that, but there's some intuition there of, oh, this just seems really hard. Maybe it's not possible to do this. But I think it is actually possible. There's no reason it can't pencil out. Software type people just aren't used to working on that type of problem. So I think that once you start to see a few success stories, then people will see that there's a path there. And they will come with their machete and start to hack away in the jungle and create even more of a path. And it'll just become like more and more trodden.
But what would seem like a success story? And where do you draw the line between being a real estate development, a master plan community, a new city, and a startup city? What would be the business model? What would the founder do? Would it be local? Would it be a master plan community? Will it be like a negotiation with a government doing a charter city? What would not count? If you do a new development with a university focused in computer science, would that be a startup city?
Pronomos is like interested in being able to make your own laws and the extent to which you have increased autonomy compared to the country you're operating out of. So a free trade zone is one step in that direction. The reason why Prospera in Honduras was one of the earliest investments, because Honduras has this unique system. I believe it's unique in the world, where you can create what's called a ZEDE, which is about economic employment and development. And it gives people who run these zones complete carte blanche, like blank slates.
Zona de empleo.
It allows you to create an entirely new legal structure. You don't get to rewrite your own criminal laws. You still have to use Honduras criminal law, but you can write all of the commercial laws, the labor laws, all of that sort of thing from scratch, which is to contrast from like a free trade zone or a free zone or whatever you want to call them. They have different names in different countries, which usually have one or two things change, but are fairly similar to the surrounding country. So that's what Pronomos is interested in. If I speak from my personal interest, I would be interested in seeing that. But I also don't think it's the only interesting kind of startup city out there. If some of these ski communities we're talking about really become like year-round communities, and I don't know, maybe a bunch of hedge fund managers move to Aspen, and now suddenly there's a hedge fund manager community in Aspen. That would be an interesting example for me. I don't know if I would say it's like a charter city. I would not say it's a charter city, but I might say it's a startup city or something like that. So I don't know. It's a spectrum. I don't think there's one crisp definition.
It is a spectrum, and everybody has a different definitions. Is it on purpose or is it not on purpose that Pronomos, is it public? If I ask you where have they invested, are you able to say where or not?
I've always assumed it was public, but now that, given that it's not on the website, maybe I will actually hold off. I'll ask them if I can share, but it's definitely public that they've invested in Prospera.
You had the crypto thing with A16Z, Andreessen Horowitz. There is this urge between the people in software engineering and designers who have this native urge of improving the physical and digital world. But I wonder if the new technologies are rising right now, let's say crypto, DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations. Real estate developers usually don't focus on public spaces because they don't give money and they want to extract every square meter they can, but I know that's not the case. There are no institutions or structures focused on public goods, or very little. What would happen if you had decentralized autonomous organizations where the community invests in community benefits? The community invests in the temple of their neighborhood, and the community invests on this structure and public spaces. This new way of making decisions with algorithms can improve the incentive structure to have more public spaces in our community, like libraries, laboratories, etc.
An interesting contrast here is land ownership. So land ownership serves as equity in a city. It's not a perfect comparison, and there's some very important differences, but high level is similar. I live in Miami Beach. I don't own my house, but let's say I did. If Miami Beach adds a new library, now that improves the value of my home, because people who love libraries now want to live here. Or if there's a lot of homeless people doing drugs in the park, the value of my house is going to go down. So I think land ownership has historically served as equity, but it's not perfect, because like people who rent don't have equity, myself included. I don't own here. And it also creates NIMBY issues where the land you own is not the same as the land your neighbor owns. And if your neighbor starts to do construction to improve their house, they're helping their equity, but they're hurting your equity because now it's like noisy. And so you want to stop them because you don't want construction next to your house. I would love to see people experiment. Instead of having land ownership as the equity that people have in their community, what would it look like to have equity in the city overall? So I don't know what this looks like, but maybe it's something like they own shares in the company that runs the community. And this gives you like a right to live somewhere or something like that in the community. It gives you some voting powers or something like that. And then because you own equity, it might incentivize you to push for things that might not be good for your short-term interest. Maybe there will be some construction noise because people are building a library across the street from you, but long-term is good for you because now the community is more beautiful, it has better education, whatever it is. So I don't know exactly how you would structure that. I'm not even totally convinced it would work, but it's like an experiment that I would like to see people run, is what would equity look like in cities?
Yeah, and I'm sure it would work, and I'm positive that we have to make more of that. Just if you have companies that give equity, they usually tend to do better than companies that don't give equity. And it's a perfect way to align interests. I'm going to ponder about how to make that work.
Equity would maybe not be that much. So your like local interests would still dominate. I think that's a pretty valid critique. But I also think there is something fundamentally different about having a small amount of equity versus no equity at all. It's just because it just gets you to think about something a little differently. You start to think about it as an owner. It might still be that you have other interests that dominate, but it gets you starting to think in a mindset. You don't have to have a ton of equity to start to have some of that mind shift. It might be even more effective if you do have a lot of equity, but I think it's like even just having a small amount gets you thinking. You can see this with crypto. In 2017, ICOs were going crazy. People who bought tokens in ICOs early would do marketing for that coin because they had equity. And some of them didn't even have that much, but they would go out and shill the coin on Reddit and write blog posts about why this coin was going to change global financial system forever or whatever. And again, maybe that's not what you want, because those people were pretty obnoxious and made the crypto space look illegitimate and had a lot of problems. But you cannot deny that they had a lot of enthusiasm. And I think that was because they were owners of the network. And so I think, could you take 10% of that enthusiasm and direct it in a more productive way? I think there's a lot of energy there that could be used for good.
That's a great way to think about it. Okay, I'll think about it much more. I have been studying a lot about what you have done, and it's very impressive. I recommend everybody to read your blog. It's amazing. You have great sources for cities and books and reviews, etc. I will put everything I'm saying in the show notes. And your podcast, also the YouTube videos I saw about you were extremely eloquent, and your ability to write and communicate is off the charts. So congratulations, you have amazing skill and a very interesting way of thinking. So thank you for sharing, and I hope we can do much more in the future. So do you have anything to add to the audience that you would like to say?
Well, I guess one thing I'm working on right now, I'm about to publish a really long document about Prospera, the charter city I mentioned in Honduras. It's about 40 pages long, and it's structured as an FAQ. I had so many questions, and I thought other people would find it interesting, especially other people who are building cities like yourself. It's not quite published yet, but you'll find a link of that on my website, which is devonzuegel.com. That'll be published hopefully this week, although I've been saying that for a while. It's a monster document, but hopefully a useful resource to people.
Oh, that's so cool. I didn't know you were writing that. I'm very excited to read that. And also, they can find you in Twitter.
It's just my name at Devon Zuegel, and I tweet too much, so I'm sorry.
You have a great Twitter feed. And also, you have Devon Does, right?
Pardon? Oh,
You
yes, I
have-
do. I do have Devon Dos. Estoy aprendiendo el castellano y por eso tengo un Twitter de castellano, pero ella está durmiendo un poco ahora. No he, ¿cómo se dice? Tuiteado
No
mucho
has tuiteado.
sí, pero
Bueno.
necesito hacerlo más porque es una buena manera para aprender.
No, increíble que estás aprendiendo y sabes español excelentemente bien y me pareció impresionante que hasta viniste a Panamá y has ido mucho por Latinoamérica, lo cual me sorprende porque, bueno, pues no encuentras a mucha gente que haya ido de Estados Unidos, que haya ido mucho a Latinoamérica.
Ahora
Así
vivo en Miami, que es como se
es casi que
capital
Latinoamérica.
sí, sí, es casi Latinoamérica y por eso
Yo, la
tengo
mayoría,
muchos
la mayoría de la
estudiantes.
gente en Miami habla español, yo creo, ¿o no?
Sí, la mayoría. Cuando estás en un Uber, todos esperan que hablas castellano y se sorprenden un poco cuando hablas inglés. Todos piensan
wow.
que yo soy latina y en mi opinión yo no me parece latina. Está bien, pero no.
¿Y de dónde te dicen?
Pero en Miami todos son.
¿De dónde te dicen que eres? Porque se te acaba de salir un show ahí argentino
Sí,
importante.
sí, sí, puede ser.
¿De
Puede
qué
ser.
país te dicen, de qué país te preguntan que eres?
Generalmente Argentina, pero mi acento no es perfecto y por eso están un poco confundidos.
Ya.
Dicen que, ok, estás usando el che y el voceo y todo esto, pero hablas como una boluda y por eso no sé cómo,
Qué
¿qué
risa,
estás
qué
haciendo?
risa. Well, thank you, Devon.
Thank
It is
you.
always a pleasure talking to you, and I'll see you very soon. So thank you very much.
Yes, sounds good. Looking forward to it. Bye,
Bueno, pues,
Henry. Ciao.
chao.